How do you follow up one of the most important films in the entire history of your country? Imagine being in charge of a project of that magnitude. Millions of eyes are guaranteed to be overseeing your next move. To fail, your career and livelihood may very well be ruined. To succeed, you would become the stuff of legends. Japanese filmmaker Tomoyuki Tanaka found himself in that very position in November 1954 while at a welcome home party for executive producer Iwao Mori. Tanaka was tasked with creating a sequel to his magnum opus, Godzilla. Mori was very pleased with the box office results for that film and instructed Tanaka to produce a sequel as quickly as humanly possible. Tanaka attempted to recruit Ishiro Honda, the director of the first Godzilla movie, to direct the sequel. However, Honda was already hard at work on the 1955 melodrama Love Tide, and could not return to direct the sequel to Godzilla. Mori grew worried. In Japanese cinema, sequels were rather uncommon. Fearing momentum would be lost, Mori pressured Tanaka to quickly find another director. He then hired Motoyoshi Oda, a trusted and prolific director at Toho. Oda began working on what would become known as Godzilla Raids Again. The screenplay was written by Takeo Murata, who introduced a new monster, Anguirus. However, many ambitious elements of the script were cut due to time and budget constraints. For example, he had originally wanted to show a scene of chaos and looting in the middle of a monster battle. Eiji Tsuburaya returned to handle special effects, using various camera speeds to achieve different effects. Haru Nakajima reprised his role as Godzilla, while Katsumi Tezuka, who played Godzilla very briefly in the '54 film, played Anguirus. The suits were redesigned for better mobility and comfort. Don't get me wrong, they were still very difficult to wear, but at least now they can move around and fight. Godzilla Raids Again was released on April 24th, 1955, but in the eyes of the filmmakers, the film could hardly qualify as a success. Sure, it was the 10th highest grossing film of the year in Japan, but audiences weren't too fond of it. But they also didn't hate it. It was just meh. So, what happened? And why do so many consider it to be a failure compared to the original Godzilla movie? Well, let's get right into it. Godzilla Raids Again occurs a few years after the original Godzilla. Pilot Tsukioka, who works for Kaiyo Fishing Incorporated, encounters engine-troubled Koji Kobayashi on Iwato Island, where they see Godzilla battling a new quadruped monster named Anguirus. They escape the island as the two monsters battle and dive into the water. The pilots assist Dr. Yamane and law enforcement in Osaka. Dr. Yamane shows footage of the first Godzilla attack, explaining that the oxygen destroyer ended it, but with its creator dead, there are no effective defenses against Godzilla. He suggests using flares to lure Godzilla away and implementing a blackout. Later, Godzilla heads towards Osaka Bay. The Japanese defense forces turn off the city's electricity and use flares to lure Godzilla away. Escaped prisoners cause a police chase, ending in an explosion that draws Godzilla back to the mainland. Anguirus appears and the two monsters begin to fight violently, destroying Yamaji's cannery and killing the prisoners. Godzilla then defeats Anguirus by biting his neck and then firing off his atomic breath at the beast before returning to water, leaving Anguirus to die alone in the ocean. Yamaji moves operations to Hokkaido and sends Kobayashi to work as a trawler captain. At a company dinner, Tsukioka reunites with his college friend Tajima, but their dinner is interrupted by news that Godzilla has sunk another ship. The next morning, Tsukioka helps the Japanese defense forces locate Godzilla on Kamiko Island. Kobayashi tries to stop Godzilla from escaping, but he gets hit by Godzilla's atomic breath and dies crashing into the mountaintop. His crash causes a small avalanche that buries Godzilla. From there, the Japanese defense forces decide to continue firing upon the mountain, burying Godzilla under an even bigger avalanche. Finally, Tsukioka triggers the last avalanche, burying Godzilla for good. As the film ends, he reflects and feels relieved and tells Kobayashi's spirit that together, they have defeated Godzilla. Godzilla Raids Again is the definition of an underwhelming sequel. Granted, that doesn't mean that it's an all-around terrible movie. There are aspects of the film that I do appreciate. For starters, I like the chemistry between Tsukioka and Kobayashi. Their friendship feels genuine and adds a layer of emotional depth to the story. The performances by Hiroshi Koizumi and Minoru Chiaki stand out here. These actors are having a lot of fun with the role and do their best with what they're given. I remember when I first saw this movie as a kid and I was just shocked that they killed off Kobayashi near the end of the film, since he was somewhat of a comedic sidekick to the stoic lead. However, I think this narrative choice works really well, despite it being very shocking. There are so many characters like Kobayashi in countless action movies, where it's the comedic sidekick, kind of bumbling but not really. They hardly affect the plot in a meaningful way. The same cannot be said, though, for Kobayashi, who sacrifices himself to stop Godzilla. It honestly makes his character more memorable and more interesting. The scenes showing the Japanese self-defense forces strategizing to combat Godzilla highlight the ingenuity and determination of the people, but it's also just so futile, knowing that these jets and tanks and strategy, it can't defeat Godzilla no matter how hard they try. These sequences are nowhere near as complex and interesting as the 1954 film, but like I said, it's incredibly hard to follow up a film of that magnitude. Another positive aspect is the introduction of the new monster, Anguirus. Having Godzilla fight another monster is a genius move that single-handedly kept the franchise alive beyond this point. I honestly believe that if this film was just Godzilla by himself attacking Japan again, the franchise would have been dead in the water from here on out. Speaking of being dead in the water, Anguirus is a cool monster. His design and concept are super interesting, and it provides a fresh challenge for Godzilla. The idea of tying him to Godzilla's origin is really cool. Not to mention, an irradiated ankylosaur is just such a badass concept, even if he doesn't really resemble an ankylosaur that much. Katsumi Tezuka does a great job of portraying Anguirus. The suit can appear clumsy at times, and, it does just look like a guy crawling around on the ground, but that's not exactly Tezuka's fault. Speaking of suits, the Godzilla suit in Godzilla Raids Again is fantastic. It's a more streamlined version compared to the 1954 predecessor, which was necessary to accommodate for the increased combat scenes in the film. The slimmer design allows for more dynamic and agile movements, making the fight scenes more intense and believable. The fangs on the suit give Godzilla a terrifying predatory appearance, enhancing its fearsome presence. The face on the suit is particularly striking, with an uncanny expression that adds to the overall menacing look. Alright, I gotta talk about this, so here we go. The 1955 Godzilla suit, as well as the film, Godzilla Raids Again, tend to be frequently associated with the analog horror series The Man in the Suit by Unknowingly. I've already covered this series on my channel, so go check out that video if you want, but I do think that a lot of the horror in that series works so well because of how the 1955 Godzilla suit looks. There are so many other analog horror series that outright just use the Godzilla Raids Again suit because of how uncanny and weird it looks. The combination of the suit's improved mobility and frightening aesthetics makes it a standout element of Godzilla Raids Again. It might very well be one of my all-time favorite suits out of the entire Showa era, and it's extremely underrated by fans. So kind of a funny story about the suits that were used in this film. Funny, I guess, maybe more depressing than anything else. After Godzilla Raids Again was released, Toho aimed to introduce the film to Western audiences, but had trouble securing a distributor. Meanwhile, ABPT Pictures, an American distribution company, was producing a film titled The Volcano Monsters. The two companies reached an agreement that the second Godzilla suit, along with the Anguirus suit, would be sent to LA for additional filming. However, ABPT went bankrupt, with its assets being taken over by other production companies. Both the second Godzilla suit and the Anguirus suit vanished and remain missing to this day. So, yeah, kind of funny, kind of depressing, but getting back to the positives, there are some really neat action set pieces here. The final assault on Godzilla is tense and well executed. The fact that Godzilla has already killed Anguirus at this point adds a ton of suspense to the assault, because if another monster couldn't stop the Big G, then how could the military possibly stop him? I also really like the scene where the convicts cause a fire that results in the monsters being led towards land and attacking. It borders on being like comedic levels of boobery, imagery. It's like something out of Abbott and Costello, but I love it. Beyond that, though, Godzilla Raids Again is a lackluster movie that utterly fails as being a passable follow-up to the original Godzilla film. I don't have a problem with Godzilla battling another monster. I don't have a problem with the tone being somewhat lighter and a little goofier here and there. There's nothing wrong with a movie having a lighter tone compared to its predecessor. There seems to be this weird attitude where people think that a film being darker makes it automatically good. That's a mindset that I disagree with because tone does not equate to quality. Ultimately, I have a problem with everything about this film feeling more like a cheap cash grab rather than an interesting follow-up that continues the themes of its predecessor while also delivering on some quality kaiju entertainment. Godzilla Raids Again fails as a sequel to Godzilla 1954 because it lacks originality and depth. The original film was groundbreaking, delivering a profound message about the horrors of nuclear war and human hubris through its dark and somber tone. It used Godzilla as a metaphor for nuclear devastation, making it not just a monster movie, but a very important commentary on real-world issues. In contrast, Godzilla Raids Again does not expand on any of these themes or even introduce new ones. Instead, it just rehashes the same basic plot points. A giant monster appears, wreaks havoc, and it must be stopped. While it does introduce a new monster to the dynamic, this addition feels more like an attempt to add novelty rather than develop the story in a meaningful way. The conflict between Godzilla and Anguirus lacks the symbolic weight and emotional resonance of the original Godzilla's rampage through Tokyo. The overall tone of Godzilla Raids Again is also very inconsistent and less impactful as a result. The 54 film's slow and deliberate pacing and haunted imagery creates a sense of dread and gravitas. In the sequel, the pacing is faster, especially during the monster fights, which are more chaotic and less visually striking. The quick movements of the monsters, coupled with the less meticulous special effects, make the battles feel more like two men in suits wrestling rather than titanic creatures clashing. This diminishes the sense of scale and realism that was so effectively conveyed in the original. Additionally, the film lacks the same sense of character development and drama. In Godzilla 54, the characters were deeply affected by the events of the film, with their stories intertwined with the larger narrative about the destructive power of technology. They hardly felt like characters and were more like real people. In Godzilla Raids Again, the vast majority of the side characters feel more like placeholders, present only to move the plot forward rather than to provide any meaningful commentary or emotional depth. Like I said, the two main characters have good chemistry, but the writing utterly fails to make them interesting. Beyond that, even the fights in Godzilla Raids Again are pretty underwhelming. The speed of these battles is unusually fast, which has both positive and negative effects. On one hand, the rapid pace makes the clashes between Godzilla and Anguirus feel extremely violent and intense. We watch as these two beasts rip and tear at each other with ferocity. This brutality adds a raw primal energy to their encounters, making them feel more dangerous and unpredictable. However, the downside to this is that the fast-paced fighting diminishes the sense of scale and weight that was so effectively conveyed in the original Godzilla movie. In the first film, the footage of Godzilla was often slowed down, which gave the monster a sense of immense power and size. The deliberate heavy movements made Godzilla appear more formidable and otherworldly. In contrast, the unaltered speed in Godzilla Raids Again makes the monster's fights look less like epic clashes of titans and more like two men in suits wrestling, which they are, but it looks pretty obvious here. This lack of slow motion makes the battles feel very cheap and less impactful. Before wrapping up here, we gotta talk about the American version of Godzilla Raids Again, which was retitled to Gigantis the Fire Monster. I already mentioned this before when I was talking about the suits, but the initial plan was for the entire Japanese film to be reworked with all new human scenes featuring American actors, with the kaiju stuff remaining completely intact. It would have been titled The Volcano Monsters, but of course ABPT went bankrupt, so the Volcano Monsters was scrapped. The remaining producers ended up just opting to redub the Japanese film and add some minor alterations here and there. Paul Schreibman, one of the producers, decided to change Godzilla's name in the American dub to Gigantis. the reasoning behind this actually makes a lot of sense on paper. Godzilla was killed in the last movie, so this is a new monster from the same species, but it just goes by a different name. The filmmakers didn't want theater goers to get confused, since Godzilla was killed by the oxygen destroyer in the last movie. Now, in execution, this is awful. This is terrible. The name Gigantis is so generic, and it just feels wrong seeing a monster that is so clearly Godzilla being called a different name. Moving beyond the whole Gigantis thing though, the performances in the English dub are surprisingly good. Legendary Star Trek actor George Takei is featured in the dub in one of his first roles. Paul Frees, the man of 1,000 voices, is also featured in the dub. Frees is a legendary voice actor who was around during the golden age of animation, working for companies like Rankin Bass and Disney. He was in a bunch of Tom and Jerry shorts, but my favorite role that he did was as the host of the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland.
Whenever candlelights flicker, where the air is deathly still, that is the time when ghosts are present, practicing their terror.
Getting back on track, something I really hate about the American dub of Godzilla Raids Again is the fact that they removed Godzilla's iconic roar and just replaced it with Anguirus's roar. Yet again, this removes the essence and personality of the character of Godzilla and makes him feel more like a generic 1950s movie monster. It also gets really annoying hearing the same roar over and over and over again. For a while, the American dub, or Gigantis the Fire Monster, was lost media for decades. Once the film ended its theatrical run in the early 60s, the movie wasn't screened anywhere else. That version of the film wasn't broadcasted on TV, and it wasn't available as a physical release, since that really wasn't a thing back then in the 60s. Once the rights to the film went back to Toho in the mid-80s, Gigantis the Fire Monster would eventually see various physical releases as well as television broadcasts in the US and in English-speaking countries. Much like Gigantis the Fire Monster, the original Japanese version, Godzilla Raids Again, is a mixed bag, and it comes off as a superficial attempt to cash in on the success of the original film. It prioritizes spectacle over substance, failing to capture the innovative spirit and profound messaging that made Godzilla 1954 a classic. Instead of being a thoughtful continuation of the story, it feels like a rushed production aimed at making a quick profit, lacking the originality, depth, and emotional impact that a true sequel should have. It's honestly a shame. This could have been a really neat follow-up to such an incredible movie. However, it just feels like another forgettable 1950s monster flick from this era. And with all of that out of the way, I'm Cole McCormick. You're watching Firewood Media. This is part 2 of a massive Godzilla retrospective project where I will be reviewing and reflecting on every single Godzilla movie and TV show. I've already covered the American movies and the original 1954 film, so go and check that out. In my last one, I talked about how these would be weekly posts, and I quickly realized that there's no way I can do that. The script for King Kong vs. Godzilla is like way too long right now for this to be something I could make weekly, so it's going to be more monthly. So stay tuned. Next month, I'll be covering King Kong vs. Godzilla. As much as I want to get this whole retrospective project finished, it actually kind of works out well if I do it this way, where it's monthly, because it should wrap up in 2027. Which is when the next MonsterVerse movie comes out. So I should be able to cover that movie, and I should be up to date with everything, and then I can post all of these as one big retrospective, which is awesome, I think. So yeah, it's going to take a bit longer than I thought it would. Consider becoming a member to support the channel. It's kind of like Patreon, but it's all through YouTube. For just $1.99 a month, you'll receive member shoutouts and your name featured as an executive producer in all of our film projects. You don't have to if you don't want to, it's just an extra perk for anyone that wants to support the channel, while also getting to see some unique content. Also really quick, we now have merch. You can see I've been wearing this for the entire video, and our Attack of the Man-Eating Werewolf from Mars t-shirt. So go check those out on the merch store. We have other stuff as well, so go and check that out. I'd really appreciate it. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.